Then by about 1940, the term that policymakers started to use was this term integration, which was a kind of a step back to amalgamation. So Māori would be New Zealanders, but they would be culturally distinct. So we would still perform our arts, we would have some of our crafts, we might have our language, but that would be up to us, because the language would survive on its own if it was a strong language, which has never really made sense to me, because if that were true, we wouldn't have to teach English in our schools, if languages could survive without support. In the 1980s, the term became mainstreaming. So, again, this idea that Māori would come into this, there's some kind of mainstream of New Zealand life, and Māori would have to exist in that mainstream. So that's a kind of what's at the base of how I think about Māori policy. And I want to just play around with some of the ideas about how it looked on the ground. So by 1900, there was a strong belief that Māori were successfully amalgamated. And there was lots of evidence. So this is some of the evidence. So by 1891, Māori were just a mere 7% of the population. So it'd gone from being the dominant population to a militarily defeated 7%. And people at the time believed that the Māori population would continue to decline. So they didn't put it together that there was a huge influx of Europeans after the wars of the 1860s, just massive influx. The population evened out in about 1860, half and half. And then the decline is partly explained by increasing European numbers, not dying off Māori. But was that your question?
Yeah, I was just wondering if it's relative or...
Yeah. So hard to get to the detail of this because our census data was so poor in that period, and Māori have got a history of not participating in the census if they didn't feel like it. There's some great examples with chiefs sending their people away when the census taker was turning up in the community and deliberately avoiding it. Some great quotes from Māori people saying, "Oh, we know you only come to count us because then you can tax us. So, we don't want to play that game, thanks." There's a view that Māori participated in the mainstream political system and therefore they were amalgamated or assimilated. There's been intermarriage among Māori and Pākehā. Pākehā is the term that we use for European. So there's a long history of intermarriage in New Zealand, and by 1900 it was used as a way of saying, therefore Māori are assimilated. Māori people by 1900 were farming their land along European lines, particularly on the east coast of the North Island. And again, it was used as evidence that Māori were assimilated. In New Zealand, we have this massive Māori land court which is responsible for land titles. And that was also evidence of amalgamation. The fact that Māori took their land into the court and got so-called proper title issued was evidence that Māori were amalgamated. Some of the rhetoric around the establishment of the Māori land court runs along the lines that if you could strike at the heart of Māori land, you would cut through the communism and tribalism of the Māori people. And that would kind of, then they'd have to be like the rest of New Zealand because they couldn't be communal anymore. And education policy often emphasised amalgamation and children learning to play European instruments. There's children learning to cook European foods, the girls learning to sew and cook, the boys learning woodwork. That was all seen as part of amalgamating Māori. And of course the language. There was a big push from the 1880s for instruction to occur in English, not in Māori. So the earlier schools were teaching in Māori. The missionary schools all taught in Māori. So they were quite, and Māori quite liked it that way from what I can gather. They're quite happy to learn to read and write. You know, quite, as the white lens suggests, quite happy to be educated. But it didn't mean they wanted to give up their language. And so you get these great debates about whether, you know, whether teaching instruction should occur in English or in Māori. Now I'm going to unpick all those points. So by 1891, yes, as far as we can tell, you know, that was a low point for the Māori population, but the population actually started picking up from that 7%. People didn't notice it until the 1920s. They're like, oh dear, I thought these people were dying out. What are they doing? Increasing in number. It's not how it's meant to go. There was a strong push by some Māori groups to have separate political representation. I should probably explain the representation. So in 1867, there was a Māori Representation Act was passed, which gave Māori 4 seats, so 4 electorates, and you could nominate a Māori, you know, nominate your person and put them into Parliament. The seats were set up without consultation with Māori. A lot of Māori didn't like them because they weren't organised tribally. They just divided the country into 4. One group started calling them the 4 quarters. So nothing, no relationship with tribal boundaries. A number of people said, well, it's a waste of time because you're never going to get one person to represent all those tribes. It's not going to work that way. And so there was a long period of some Māori groups trying to set up their own parliament distinct from the central government. Some Māori groups maintaining that they had their own authority and they didn't have to participate in Parliament. Other Māori groups, and this is where my people are from, they took the view that we could make those seats work for us if we put all our energy and effort behind one person we all agree on and then lobby to get that person into Parliament, and then that person, one of their jobs will be to take bills that we want. And that's what they tried. So one of our MPs, a guy called Hone Heke, was asked to take a native rights bill, which was an attempt to set up a separate Māori Parliament. And it failed because, you know, there were only 4 members against the rest of Parliament, and basically the European members of Parliament just walked out one at a time until there was no quorum. And he took the bill 3 times and it was never successful. What he was successful at doing, though, was reading our Treaty of Waitangi out in the House and reading some other documents. And when I look at the debate, I feel, my view is that he understood the process and understood that by at least having the floor and reading those documents, he was putting them on the table in Parliament and that it was being recorded. And then historians come along 100 years later and get to go back over it again. Okay, yes, and yes, it's true, the statistics for half-caste seem to be there, but there was some research done in the 1910s that showed that children who had a Māori and a Pākehā parent were probably more likely to grow up Māori. My reading of that is that it's because it was probably the mother who was the Māori parent and she was responsible for the upbringing of the children. So that's my reading of it. The other thing is that I think that they were still largely living in Māori communities. But the government at the time liked to count half-castes and say half-caste living as European or half-caste living as Māori, so that, you know, you can see them trying to categorise people, and we can shift these people into the amalgamated category and just focus on shifting some more that way. It's true also that by 1900 there were some Māori groups who were farming along European lines. It kind of makes sense that you need European technology, and you know, so there was a lot of dairy farming and sheep farming quite early. But when you look at those groups closely, what you find is that they were organised tribally. So in New Zealand we have dairy companies which kind of manage the milking process and getting the milk to market and that kind of thing. So in Māori groups, their dairy company would often resemble who the chiefs were for the area. So is it European farming? Well, yeah, sure, in terms of it being dairy farming. Was it European in terms of its leadership and management? Well, I think that's debatable and needs some closer research. It's true also that many people had taken their land to the Māori land court, but there were large districts, including up north. That's Taitokerau there. That's for the north, and Tairāwhiti is the east coast. So there were huge tracts of land that had not been taken anywhere near the court, and Māori didn't want to engage with the court in particular. And there was still this kind of disengagements with people not sending their children to school, or people saying it's not that we're opposed to education, but we're opposed to education that we're not controlling. So we want our kids to be educated, but not at your school. So there's quite a bit of that happening. So again, it kind of unsettles the idea that was prevalent in 1900 that Māori were completely amalgamated. The problem, I think, for New Zealand was that the myth of successful amalgamation was far stronger than the reality. And it took many years for historians to go back and unpick it all. And in the meantime, we got histories that emphasised the progress of the nation state, emphasised Māori people becoming more and more a part of that, except for a few little pockets of resistance here and there, but they were never enough to worry about, and they were never going to be a threat to the overall progress of New Zealand.